Social power is something we all feel every day. But have you ever tried to actually measure it? For decades, social scientists thought they had a simple answer. Turns out the real story is, well, it's a whole lot more interesting. Welcome to a scientific detective story about what power really is and how our brains figure it all out.
So let's start with a simple question. How powerful is your boss? I mean, really, you probably have a gut feeling about their level of influence, right? But what is that feeling based on? Is it their job title, their expertise, the fact they can give you a bonus or a bad project? Today, we're going to put that gut feeling under the microscope.
All right, here's our game plan. We're going to deconstruct what power even means. Then, we'll look at the 5 classic ways to measure it. We'll see why the old way of just adding them up was a huge mistake. And then, we'll get into the fun stuff. A new scale, the ultimate test, and the big reveal. How our perception of power is so much more than just the sum of its parts. Okay, first things first. To solve this mystery, we've got to start with a really clear definition of what we're even talking about. And for that, we have to go back to the foundational work of 2 researchers, French and Raven from 1959. The absolute key word here is potential. Think of it like this. Power is a fully charged battery. It's just sitting there, holding all this potential energy. Influence? That's when you actually plug something in and use that energy. Power is the stored potential. Influence is power in action. And that difference, it's literally the key to everything we're going to talk about. So, if power is all about potential, how do we measure it? Well, French and Raven gave us a toolkit. They identified 5 fundamental sources or bases of power. And for a long time, this was the gold standard for researchers. Let's do a quick run-through. First, there's legitimate power. This comes straight from your job title. Your boss is your boss. That's it. Then there's reward power. Pretty simple. It's the power to give you stuff you want. The flip side of that coin is coercive power, the power to punish. Then you've got expert power, which comes from being really, really good at something. And finally, referent power. This is the influence you have just because people genuinely like and respect you. Now, what's cool is you can actually sort these into 2 main buckets. Legitimate, reward, and coercive power, those all come from your position. They're tied to the title on your business card. But expert and referent power, that's personal. That's all you. You can take that with you wherever you go. And this is where our mystery really begins. For years, everybody just assumed you could figure out someone's total power by adding up those 5 bases. 1 + 2 + 3, and so on. It seems logical, right? But that simple math was completely wrong. In fact, the very researchers were following on this journey, Nestler and his team, basically called it out. They said, hey, wait a minute, just summing these things up into one big score, that might be totally inappropriate. They knew something was missing. So why doesn't the simple math work? Well, a few reasons. First, context is everything. A CEO's legitimate power just isn't the same as a brilliant scientist's expert power. They aren't interchangeable units. Second, some power can actually backfire. Use too much coercive power, threats, and you don't get compliance, you get resistance. And finally, there's this X factor, the idea that our brains don't just use a checklist. Maybe, just maybe, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So, if the old tool is broken, what do? You build a new one. And that's exactly what these researchers did. Their goal was to stop counting the individual bricks and instead find a way to measure the whole wall, that holistic, gut-level feeling of power we all have. And here she is. Meet the hero of our story, the global power scale. This scale just cuts right to the chase. It asks direct questions that are designed to capture that overall feeling, like, my supervisor can get me to work harder. It's not about the pieces, it's about measuring the total overall potential to influence. Now, to make sure their new scale was really working, they also tested it against a rival idea. This other concept sees power as something more negative, just pure control, the ability to make you do things you don't want to. They had to prove their scale was measuring that holistic sense of influence, not just raw, forceful control. And now for the main event, the climax of our detective story. The scientists took their new global power scale and put it in a head-to-head showdown with the old methods to see which one was the real champion. The setup for this test was brilliant. They went out and surveyed 346 graduate students about their supervisors. The ultimate goal? To see which measure of power could best predict how likely a student was to actually comply with their supervisor's requests. The most accurate predictor wins. So, how'd it go? Well, first, they looked at just the 5 individual power bases on their own. And you know what? Together, they explained a pretty respectable 50% of why students complied. Okay, not bad. That's a solid start. But then came the big moment. They took those 5 bases and used the old method. They just summed them up into one score. How much more did that simple sum explain? A big, fat 0. Nothing. It added absolutely no new predictive power. This was the nail in the coffin for the old way of thinking. And then they added their new global power scale to the mix. And what happened? Boom. It explained an additional 7% of compliance. That might not sound like a huge number, but in statistics, that's the smoking gun. This was the proof. Their new scale was capturing something real, something that the simple math was missing entirely. So, the big question is, where did that extra 7% come from? It wasn't some secret 6 power base. The answer, it turns out, is all about how our brains do math. And let me tell you, it's not simple arithmetic. And this brings us to the huge insight from this whole story. Our brain doesn't run a spreadsheet when it judges power. It doesn't go down a checklist. Instead, it takes all the information in and creates a single, holistic impression. That gut feeling we talked about at the beginning, that's your brain's final calculation, and it's a judgment that is way more powerful and more accurate than just adding up the pieces. The fancy term for this is implicit power theories. Basically, they're mental shortcuts. When your brain sees a few strong signs of power, let's say a big title and a lot of expertise, it doesn't just stop there. It generalizes. It infers other powerful traits, creating this overall expectancy that this person is influential. That's the extra 7%. It's the synergy that our brain creates from all the individual pieces. So, we've seen that judging power is so much more complex than a checklist. Our minds create this rich, holistic picture that's actually better at predicting reality than just looking at the individual components. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. Who in your life, at work, at home, anywhere, are you evaluating with a simple checklist? In whose true holistic influence might you be completely misjudging?